Hi, everyone. Welcome to Waffle Games. I'm Kira, and I'm the CEO of the EGD Collective. And with me, I have Ben and Kendi, and we're your hosts for today. Um, so before we get started, we just wanted to tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do. So the EGD Collective is a community that creates leaders of character and equity through games. We were founded in 2016 at Hunter College as a student organization, and in 2019, we made the move to become a nonprofit organization. Waffle Games is our annual flagship event that supports affordable education in the games industry and just the overall democratization of games. So I'll hand it off to Ben for some house rules.
All right, the house rules are fairly simple. Be respectful to your fellow guests and panelists. There is no tolerance for harassment. Please do not harass other guests. This is something we take very seriously. Um, don't say anything bad. No slurs, no cursing, and try to keep it PG-13 as much as possible. And overall, just be courteous to your fellow guests. And I'll give
So
it off to.
Yeah, so some hop-in instructions. For the stage, if someone is presenting slides, you can double click on anybody's video or stream, and it'll make it bigger. For best viewing, you can collapse the chat sidebar. There should be like a little thing that looks like an exit button that doesn't actually make you leave the event. That just collapses the sidebar. If you'd like to attend other areas of the convention, on the left, you should see sessions, networking, and an expo. We have game developers and startups from all over the world showing their games and their services, so go check them out. And networking lets you speed network with people. Every 3 minutes, you can get whisked off to meet somebody new. Um, for schedule, you can check in reception. We have the stage schedule listed here under stage if you scroll down a little bit. But we have more sessions and panels that are happening in the session area, and you can see the full schedule in the reception. And now I'm going to hand it off to Kendi.
On the tournaments, we're going to be hosting a variety of tournaments throughout the event. Tournament registration will be available on smash.gg until 5 p.m. Eastern. You can find the links in the reception on your left-hand side. And a huge thanks to our supporters, AnyKey, Beamable, and NordVPN. Make sure to follow our Twitter at EGD Collective and tweet hashtag Waffle Games to be featured on the sidebar. And while you do that, you'll be entered to win Steam keys and other products from people that are exhibiting. Thank you very much and enjoy the event.
And so it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Kate Edwards. Kate is the executive director of the Global Game Jam, as well as the CEO and principal consultant of Geography, a consultancy which pioneered game culturalization. She is also the former executive director of the International Game Developers Association from 2012 to 2017. In addition to being an award-winning advocate who serves in several advisory roles, she is a geographer, writer, and corporate strategist. Following 13 years at Microsoft, she has consulted on many game and non-game projects for BioWare, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Lego, and many other companies.
Hi.
Hi, and we will now leave you.
Okay. Well, hi everyone. It's great to be here, and yes, so it's actually it's an honor for me to be a part of this community because I love everything that the EGD folks are doing, and it's a very cool group, and I love the initiative. So, but yeah, let's get started with. I will just dive in here with my talk. I'm going to share my slides, so hopefully you can see these. So beyond the work I do, the advocacy related work and doing great, fun stuff like running the Global Game Jam, which is near and dear to my heart, I have been doing this culturalization work as a geographer in the game industry for 28 years as of this month. So it's been a long time. And so, what's interesting, what I find fascinating about the work and about being in the game industry is that, essentially every single world that we build, because that's essentially what we do as game developers, we create worlds, and every world that we have has an incredible amount of work behind it. As we know, there are incredibly detailed worlds like Skyrim and the Elder Scrolls series, where you could read like hundreds of books with unique text and all the kind of little nitty-gritty details that goes into building out the reality of this world. Of course, there's things, like the Halo universe, which I worked on these games way back when. We've got something that takes place in the real world. So unlike the Elder Scrolls series, which is completely fictional universe, you've got something like Halo, which is our universe, but it's in the future. So they can take creative liberties with a lot of things in that context. Or you have games like Grand Theft Auto, which often take place, like GTA 5, in what I would call a hyper-real version of our world. I mean, I'm from Los Angeles originally, and I was just incredibly blown away by how accurately they captured the spirit and feeling of Los Angeles, even though it was this fictional Los Santos, in which they had that creative liberty to do a lot of things that you probably would not have done to the real Los Angeles. So, and of course, there's games like Assassin's Creed series, which uses real world geography and real history, but then it weaves that narrative, that fictional narrative, in between the real geography and history, which kind of brings a unique angle to these games. And of course, games like Minecraft. I mean, this whole Minecraft is all about world building. It's what you do. And that's one of the fun things about it, and why it's taken off so well with a lot of younger folks. But even games like Angry Birds, and what people who often perceive mobile games and games like this as, quote, simple games, that's not really the case. I think all of us understand that there's a lot of world building that goes into even something like this, and there is a narrative in this game as well, even though the narrative might be super simple, like pigs versus birds, or birds versus pigs, whatever you want to say. They have explored the narrative in other forms of media, just to kind of tease it out a bit. But there is a narrative and there is a structure here, even though the gameplay itself is pretty simple. So when we're talking about culturalization and all these kinds of worlds that we're building, basically my job and what my focus is to basically take the game worlds, that all the amazing talent I get to work with, all the stuff that they're creating, and see how are those worlds going to be compatible with the local worldviews and in the different markets around the world and the different cultures and geographies. And so what this kind of works out to be is something like a gene splicing exercise, where I'm trying to see how does the content work with each other, and the outcome of that is culturalized content. And so I tend to work in this zone of where content assets, character design, symbology, objects in the environment, all that kind of stuff is either going to be compatible or incompatible between the two, between the game worlds and the local worldviews. And that's essentially, in a real small nutshell, that's basically what I do. Now, why is this important? Well, I think a lot of us realize, of course, that games are obviously a global phenomenon. But what's really interesting to me is that the growth among gamers is in non-typical places. So a lot of game developers I talk to around the world, they're still focused on, I want to release my game in the US or North America. I want to release my game in Western Europe, which is great. I mean, those are still, robust gaming markets, but that's not where the growth is. As you can see from this chart, from the data from last year, the higher growth is in emerging markets and in non-traditional markets. So, Middle East and Africa have just been exploding, for example, in terms of the use of games and the adoption of games. And of course, Latin America, Asia Pacific. I think most of us realize at this point that China is the world's largest gaming market. They surpassed the United States about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. So there's what often happens during game creation. I talk to a lot of developers who are not really thinking about the people from these regions where the growth is. They're not really thinking about those people in terms of how they're designing their game and who they're designing it for. And so now typically we talk about localization as a way of adapting content to other markets. And localization, which from my perspective is primarily language translation, that is always going to be important. I mean, it's been important for decades and decades with all kinds of software. Games are no different. So, doing language translation is very critical for legibility of the written content. But culturalization goes a bit deeper. It's not just about language, it's about every other element within the game that could cause either disruption or cause kind of adoption of the game content in a way that language alone cannot do. And so a lot of companies today are thinking deeper than just language, and they're thinking, how can I design my game and my content for other cultures and for other markets, and not just from a language standpoint, but from everything, the narrative, the characters I use, the setting that it's in, all of these different factors. And that's a recognition by a lot of companies that the growth is out there in the world, and so they need to strive to make games. If that's their goal, they need to strive to make games that are going to be appealing to a larger, basically a larger demographic around the world. To give you a quick illustration of the difference between localization and culturalization, I'll use the Kit Kat candy bar. So you can see here, these are basically the exact same product. They're a strawberry Kit Kat bar. And the top one is, Canadian and French and English, and the bottom one is in Japanese. So basically, these are essentially the same product, but with a different language wrapper. And so that's essentially what localization is. But if you take the Kit Kat candy bar to Japan, this is a great example of culturalization. So in Japan, and only in Japan, the Kit Kat candy bar has become a cultural phenomenon because the makers of this they tapped into two key things about the Japanese market. Number one is that the term Kit Kat, it happens to be very similar to the Japanese phrase kitukatsu, which is a kind of this very positive, like victorious phrase that they use in Japan. And so they were really lucked out that their name Kit Kat was very similar. So they kind of used that as a way, as a play on words, but then also they tapped into the reality that a lot of Japanese people like to collect things. It's a collector culture, and so there's a lot of enthusiasm around games and other things that have you collect things. Like should not be any surprise then that Pokemon came out of Japan. You gotta catch them all kind of thing. And so what's fascinating is that Kit Kat became a culturalized phenomenon in Japan, where you can get since they started this several years back, there's been over 600 unique flavors of Kit Kat bars. They even regionalized the flavors as well, and you can travel around to different parts of Japan to collect different Kit Kat bars. And some of my Japanese friends have admitted that they've done this, so because they just said it's super fun. And so this is an interesting phenomenon, and that's basically a difference between localization and culturalization. So with culturalization, there's two different types generally that we deal with. So one is what I would call reactive culturalization, which is usually when I'm looking for something in a game that might cause a problem for the user experience. So it's going to disrupt it. So if a player's enjoying the game and suddenly they see something that is somehow related to their culture or their particular background, and it disrupts the experience. The other side of that is proactive culturalization, where we look for ways to adapt the game content to make it more appealing or more relevant to a specific culture or region or country or whatever we choose to define. And so there's a lot of ways that we can do that. Just to give you a couple examples of this, reactive culturalization here in Fallout 3, you might recognize this. This is a two-headed Brahmin bull that wandered through the apocalyptic landscape. And this is the reason why this game did not sell in India, was because the Brahmin bull is sacred to the Hindu faith. And this version of the Brahmin bull in the game is a mutated radioactive Brahmin bull that you can eat and kill. And that really wasn't cool. And in India, they actually have laws that protect real Brahmin bulls from being harmed. And so there was enough legal concern that those laws might apply to this virtual representation as well. And it's unfortunate because the developer, we asked them to change this, like swap it out for my poorly photoshopped two-headed horse. This would have worked just fine for that market, but they didn't want to take the risk of having a build that wasn't going to work. And so basically they decided just to not do any adaptation at all. So unfortunately, that's why Fallout 3 never sold in India. Conversely, an example of proactive culturalization is where Marvel partnered with a studio in India to create this culturalized version of Spider-Man. And the initial reaction to this was very positive. People thought this is really cool that they would do this. However, the drawback of this is that they were dealing with a very, very well-known intellectual property, Spider-Man. And so what people really wanted, they found out, was not a culturalized version of Spider-Man. They wanted a localized version of Spider-Man into the many, many languages of India. There's tons and tons of languages in India. And so that was the preference of the consumers. Like, just give us Peter Parker in New York, but give us several versions of it in different languages. So one of the other differences between localization and culturalization is that typically localization tends to happen later in a typical product cycle. And I granted this is a very simplified product cycle, but so localization typically has to wait for the text content to be mostly finished so they can actually do their work and do the translation. Whereas with culturalization, a lot of work begins early in the process. And I mean very early, like in the early concept stage, because I sit down often with the producer and the writers and the artist and look at the conceptual art and kind of try and understand what is the world that they're building, who is in it, what do they do, are there factions, are there political groups, are there religions? I mean, what is going on in this world? Because then I can give guidance very early on to potential issues that might be a problem later. And so that's why it's very important to do this early. And then, of course, during the product cycle, I do some spot checks of the content being created just to make sure that everything is okay. So, for example, I've been doing this lately. A couple of projects I've been working on lately is Age of Empires 4, which I believe they're doing like a fan preview tomorrow, which is cool. And also Dragon Age 4. I've worked on all the BioWare stuff for the last many years. And so we often, for example, for a BioWare project, we're involved very, very early, looking at the very early stages of what's going on in that world. So when this work is happening, though, there's many things we have to think about. It's not just a matter of looking at something and saying yes or no, that's going to work, it's not going to work. There's a lot of reasons why it may not work, or reasons why it will work. So first of all, there's the high-level company values and goals. And when I say company, if you're an indie developer, that means you. It can mean you personally as a game creator. It could also be your small group if you have a small group of indies working together. But basically, it's your values and goals. What do you want to achieve with this game? What are you willing to change or not change depending on the feedback that you're going to get from the community or out there in the world? And that's really important. That's going to guide you a lot in the culturalization decisions. Also, the context in which content is generated is very important, because we have to remember that every one of us, whether we like it or not, we're all biased. And our bias, most of us try and overcome that bias through education and the process of education throughout our life. But nonetheless, even though we overcome that bias, we still, during the creative process, tend to rely on what we know in order to make decisions. So like for every one of us, we're from a specific geography, we're from a specific culture, specific socioeconomic background. All of these things do influence our creative decisions. And a lot of times this is subconscious. Also, the business strategy for the vertical is important. So this particularly applies to larger companies like Microsoft and Sony, because they make other things other than games. They make a lot of other stuff other than games. So they have to kind of position their decisions around how do we want to handle the games business of ours versus other facets of the business. The market strategy for a specific country or locale is also important, because companies have different strategies on what they want to achieve, because every market is different in terms of the players and the kinds of games people like and the things that are make people engage with you. Also, the market strategy for a specific game, because of course every game is different too, and depending on the genre, you may have to shift your strategy a little bit And then finally, there's the changing geopolitical and cultural and ethical factors behind what you're doing, because as if anything, hopefully the pandemic has taught people that the world is a very dynamic place, and things change very rapidly, not only socially but politically and otherwise. And so when you're releasing your game, you also have to be aware of what are the current conditions in the different markets at the time of release, because it may influence how your game will be received. So to talk a little bit now, shifting a little bit towards the world building aspect, one of the things I want to address is this idea of realization. And it's, when I say realization, I'm not talking about realism. So realism, photorealism, making things look very realistic, that's not really my concern. My concern is realization. And what I mean by that is, how much world do you need to build when you're in the game creation process? And how do you determine that? Well, for pretty much every game I've ever worked on, it comes down to two key things. Number one is the narrative goals. And like I asserted at the beginning of this talk, I believe that every single game, no matter how simple, every game has some kind of core narrative involved. And so there's the narrative goals. So what is the world and what kind of story you're trying to tell through this world? And then the experience goals, what does the player actually do in your world? What's their role in all of this? And so those two things together essentially give you this guiding principle of what your realization goals are, about how much world do we need to build in order to achieve the narrative and experience goals. And so a lot of times we have to, think really hard. What is that real core narrative that we're trying to address, and what's the core experience as well? Start simple and start with that, and then you can build on that later. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some essential tools for realizing worlds. So I will explain all of these things. Whoa, I went a little fast there. I'm sorry. So how we establish context for the world we're building, and logical consistency, and building cultural evidence, which is objects in your environment, and then selecting necessary thematic layers. So don't worry, I'm going to explain all of this. So the context one is really easy, and I kind of addressed this a little bit early on, but we typically have this dichotomy between real world games, any game that takes place in our real world, versus games that take place in a fictional world. Well, as you would imagine, it's a huge zone of overlap between these two. It is never that black and white. I mean, certainly, like I showed examples, there's games that are complete fantasy, and there's games that are complete reality. And sometimes they're almost too real, like you've probably been following some of the pushback that the game 6 Days in Fallujah has been getting, because for a lot of people that the scenario in that game is just too realistic, and it hits a raw nerve because of the subject matter. And then, of course, like I said, Grand Theft Auto with the Los Santos, it's very close to the real world, but it's not the real world. That's why I kind of call it hyper real, because it's really, really close. So setting the context is something that will come from your narrative goals. The other thing is about logical consistency in the world that you build. So typically players expect that there's logical rules that apply to everything in the world you build, to space and time and all of these things. Like most games use gravity that is kind of similar to our real world, because it's something that as a player, we understand the gravity. We understand how it works. And so, but of course, there's games that their whole game mechanic is based on the manipulation of gravity, which is completely fine. It just happens that there's still rules behind it. So people, players tend to respond really well to a world where the systems make sense for the narrative that you're trying to tell. And so they don't want to see a conflict between the content assets that are in that world and the intent of that world. And so to give you an example of this, this was a game called Cameo that I worked on a long time ago. And you can see here, so this is a complete fantasy world. It has nothing to do with our reality at all. And you can see that on the side of the road here, the artist put wooden crosses to indicate a grave marker. And so I called it out and said, well, why would they put wooden crosses on the side of the road? Because in this universe, there's no Christianity. So that symbol has no meaning for people in this world. And unfortunately, the artist, their response to me was, what else would I use? I'm like, well, I don't know, be creative. That's kind of what your job is, right? To be a creative artist and so come up with a grave marker and determine like how do you convey the idea of a grave marker in a complete fantasy world, because even a wooden cross is not applicable to every culture in our world. If you've ever seen pictures of a graveyard from the Middle East or from Japan or places like that, of course they don't use wooden crosses. There's no context for it. Another factor that's really important beyond logical consistency is about creating cultural evidence. And so this is just my fancy way of saying all the stuff that you make in your game to fill out the environment. And so oftentimes the goal should be to make the minimal amount of content to convey the presence of in-game culture. And so oftentimes during the production cycle, what I've seen, the highest risk activity is when everyone understands what the concept of the game is going to be and everyone kind of gets let loose to do their job and to do what they're excellent at, which is, the art and the writing and everything. That's oftentimes where things start going off the rails a little bit, because, everyone is tasked to kind of build out the world and create a whole bunch of stuff in a short amount of time. But a lot of times that random additional content gets thrown in and people are not really looking at it, or nobody's really serving in a strong editorial role. And so 2 key tips I have for this is make sure that when you create things, don't be lazy about it. Every single thing that's ever created in the game should have a purpose, and it should always be focused back on those realization goals that I mentioned earlier. So make sure that everything that goes into the game has a reason for being there, and it's not just some random thing that you added just because, for the hell of it. Also, somebody should ask the hard, challenging questions sometimes. And you're not challenging a person's creative ability. You're just asking for some more information about why they made that certain creative decision. And I know this is a difficult thing to do at times, because I know from firsthand experience, a lot of times, you'll get pushback from the person who did it because they think you are challenging their creative ability, but that's really not what it's about. I mean, they're amazing at what they do. What you want to know is, how did you get from the concept to what you just created, and what is so if they created a symbol, for example, that goes on a character's costume, what does that symbol mean? What was your inspiration? So sometimes asking those kinds of questions can be helpful. So here's an example of cultural evidence where, this was supposed to be a little fictional environment in this game, Pocket God. There's a lot of problems with this game, by the way, starting with the depiction of indigenous people, which is, I find it really problematic with the top knot and the kind of animal-like appearance of them. And, this game was getting a lot of criticism from Polynesian groups because, part of the whole reason for this game is you basically torture these people and you find creative ways to kill them and to feed them to sharks and let the volcano explode and kill them and all that. But they were getting pushback from different groups because they said, well, this is not cool. You're making fun of our culture. Now the developers said, well, no, this has nothing to do with your culture. It's completely fictional. Yeah, but that's not true, is it? Because I think a lot of you have already recognized what's on the right side of that island, and that's a moai. And the moai exist in one place on Earth, on Easter Island. And so by using that cultural artifact, that piece of evidence, they actually made this island a specific culture. And so you can understand why people are upset, because they do feel like the developers making fun of that culture. And so in later versions of the game, they actually swapped it out for a more fictitious thing. Unfortunately, they did not fix the indigenous depiction, but that's a whole nother issue. Now, in terms of thematic layers, one of the things that I want to mention is that, from a geographer's standpoint, one of the reasons I think we're sort of ideal for helping with world building is because we spend all of our time deconstructing the real world. So we basically take the real world and think about it in terms of, different phenomenon and themes and basically what makes up the environment around us. And so every map, every piece of cartography is actually a world rebuilding exercise. So it's where somebody took the real world, and they basically decided, what things they wanted to emphasize and show in the world, which is the map, which is a simplified representation of the real world. And so we often view the world as these thematic layers. And if you've ever seen, a geographic information system, which is what geographers and cartographers use these days, a GIS divides up the world into layers very much like this diagram. And so oftentimes I've encouraged game developers to think about world building like this. Think about what thematic layers you need to realize your world and to basically build what you need to serve those realization goals. So some of the potential thematic layers, which I'm sure you can imagine a lot of these, I'm not going to read through all of this. You can read it yourself. But as you might imagine, there's a lot of things that you could add to a world to build out the reality of it. And I'll take climatology and atmosphere just as an example, because I've worked on games where developers spent a ridiculous amount of time creating a weather system in the game, but then it never really had any impact whatsoever on the gameplay, like at all. It was there for atmospheric effect, but they went above and beyond to create this system, but then it really didn't impact gameplay. Whereas if you've played Breath of the Wild, the weather system in Breath of the Wild directly impacts gameplay. It has a one-to-one relationship. It impacts the narrative. You can't climb slippery rocks because it's raining. You get zapped by lightning, which kind of sucks. And so the weather system does directly influence the gameplay and the decisions that a player is making. And so so that basically what I'm saying is that was time very well spent. In much the same way I've worked on games where they built out like an entire economic system and with an in-game currency and all that kind of stuff, but then the player really didn't interact with it very much. So it just seems like it was kind of a pet project of somebody on the team who wanted to do it, but that was a time that was well spent because it didn't serve those realization goals. It was kind of a tangent that they went on. So what I want to talk about is some of the most challenging thematic layers that typically come up in the culturalization process. You'll probably guess most of these, but I'm going to talk about them in a little more detail because when I've been doing this work for as long as I have, these themes come up a lot in a lot of games that I work on. And so let's just kind of dive into these. So the first one is history. So if you're working on a game or you want to make a game that has anything to do with real world history, we have to remember that historical memory in a lot of markets is really persistent. People remember their history, so I think this is one of those issues where developers in North America, for example, don't have the same perspective because our countries have not been around that long versus cultures like in East Asia or in the Middle East where they can trace their roots back from millennia. And so that makes a difference on how we view history. So for example, when I worked on Age of Empires, the original games as well, this is one of the scenarios we had. This was in the original Age of Empires. And so what you can see here, this is where the Japanese in blue, the Yamatos, they invaded the Korean peninsula and basically almost took over the Chosun Empire. And so that's what you're seeing here. And that's what history tells us. That history says that's what happened. Many different historical sources say that's exactly what happened. However, and so they decided to put this into the game because it's a very challenging scenario. You're playing as the Chosun Empire. However, when we released this game into Korea, the Korean Ministry of Information said that this never happened. They said that this version of history is not correct. And so because of that, they were not going to let this game release into South Korea. And so we had to step back and think about, what are we going to do about this? Well, if you remember that chart I mentioned about multiple considerations and the things you have to think about. So first of all, this is at a time when Microsoft is trying to grow its games vertical. It's very vigorously investing in games. This is pre-Xbox, of course. That would come along a few years later. So they want to grow their games business. They also know that South Korea is a very important gaming market. Games are very popular there. They also knew from market research that real-time strategy games like Age of Empires were also very popular in South Korea. And if you know your gaming history, a year after Age of Empires came out, that's when StarCraft released in 1998, and StarCraft became a national phenomenon in Korea and basically remains a national phenomenon to this day. And so basically all the data and all the information was telling Microsoft that you need to release this game in Korea. However, we can't release it like this because the government won't accept this. So a decision where we created a version only for Korean players, in which you can see here, which was released through a download patch for Korean players, in which the Chosun Empire invaded Japan instead of Japan invading the Chosun Empire. Now, as you might imagine, this created a bunch of debate on the development team about the nature of truth and the ethics behind doing something like this. And I think it was a great debate to have because it's the right decision. It's the right debate to have. And so basically we had to say, is this the right thing to do, to change history for the sake of this market? Well, first of all, I had to remind them that most of the history in Age of Empires is very generalized. It's not super accurate anyway. The history in Age of Empire, history just serves as a backdrop for good gameplay. And they choose these different historical scenarios because of the potential for, good gameplay. And so not everything that happens in Age of Empires is completely historically accurate, just like most historical games are not completely historically accurate. That was one factor. The other factor is that a few years earlier, working on Encarta Encyclopedia, which was an encyclopedia that Microsoft created, we had different facts in different language versions of the encyclopedia. So, for example, the mountain Mont Blanc on the Italian-French border had different heights in the Italian and French versions of the encyclopedia because the two governments disagreed on the exact height of the mountain. And that was a requirement of releasing into those markets, is we had to have the correct height for the mountain. And so this is kind of similar. It's a gateway necessity. If you want to sell in that market, then there might be certain things you have to change in your content in order to do so. Is this serving up local propaganda? Yes, it is. And that is a business decision that you have to make as a game developer. Do we want to sell our game into that market, or do we not want to sell? So this is one of those difficult culturalization decisions that you have to make when you're creating your game. Also, faith is a really important topic because, many cultures out there maintain their expectations on religious beliefs. And so we have to be careful about how we portray, faith in our games. In this game, in Hitman 2, they took the main action into the Golden Temple in Amritsar, India, which is the center of the Sikh faith. And they had the main character killing Sikhs in the most sacred place of their faith, which is really not a smart idea in terms of how you set your game. So this caused a certain amount of backlash over this. When I worked on Jade Empire way back when, we had, this is a complete fantasy world. It was based on Asian culture, but it was supposed to be complete fantasy, had nothing to do with our world. And so kind of similar to that earlier example, the artist, what they did is they put prayer wheels into the environment because they said, well, it's an Asian environment, and so therefore, there you would see prayer wheels in Tibetan Buddhism, for example. But there was not supposed to be Tibetan Buddhism in this game. They had no role in this game or in this environment. So you can see what we had to do at the last minute. We had to put these kind of glowing blue cylinders to cover up the original prayer wheel artwork because we didn't have time to actually swap out the entire 3D model. And of course, games like Smite, which actually take, the pantheon of Hindu gods and they put them against, fighting against the pantheon of Norse gods and Egyptian gods. And, the difference, though, is that, most of the Norse gods and Egyptian gods are worshipped by very, very few people today. But of course, the pantheon of Hindu gods are worshipped by, about 1 billion people. So, so the game developers made a really poor decision in sort of making this equating that the Hindu gods are basically sort of irrelevant in the same way the Norse and Egyptian gods may be perceived. And then the issue of inclusion and exclusion. This is a category where people perceive inequitable treatment because of the basis of their culture or their gender, ethnicity, nationality. This is a very wide category for why people might see something and feel like this game experience is excluding me. And this is something we have to be watching for very closely. This game, Resident Evil 5, got a lot of negative backlash when it first started, when they first were releasing images before the game came out. because it shows this, Caucasian male protagonist shooting, sub-Saharan African villagers. And the imagery behind this is very stark. And, a lot of people are saying, what the hell? This is really not cool to have this kind of imagery. Well, the developer, they said, well, what's the problem? They're zombies. If you look at the image on the right, they're zombies, so they have to be killed. What's interesting here is, remember when I said the context in which content is created is very important. Well, this game was created primarily in Japan, and Japan is 98% ethnic Japanese. And so I know from firsthand experience when I was working with a lot of developers in Japan that there is not that level of understanding about diversity and ethnicity and those kind of issues in Japan, because it's just not part of their normal cultural experience. And so, that kind of relates to the idea that they didn't know what they didn't know. And of course, once they were told that this is an issue, they did make changes before the game finally came out. But it's just one of those things where they're so locked into the specific cultural context, they don't see how this might be sensitive. And so this is kind of a warning for all of us, because again, like I mentioned earlier, we all have bias. And so we have to really think hard about what we're representing in our games. And kind of think it through before we make assumptions. And it relates to very negative imagery that we reject, of course, in today. So, and of course, representation of like female characters in games. So Lara Croft was pretty much the poster child of sexist representation in video games. And I think it's really fascinating how over the years her character has evolved to become what I consider to be one of the better representations of a female protagonist in a game. But a lot of that is due to the not only the maturation of the industry to a certain degree, but it also is the fact that they hire great people like Rhianna Pratchett to write a backstory and write a depth to the character in the more recent versions of the game that certainly did not exist in the early versions of this character. And so it's I think it's really great to see how they, in a certain way, at least in my opinion, they redeemed this character to a certain degree. Also, there's intercultural tension. So sometimes there's things that happen between two or more cultures or countries that cause problems for a game. And sometimes there's nothing we can do about it because it's kind of the environment into which our game is being released. For example, I'm going to use another Age of Empires example from Korea because it just works. I'm not trying to pick on Age of Empires or Korea. But this game, when Age of Empires 2 released in Korea, a lot of Korean retailers did not want to put this on their shelf because of the image of the Japanese samurai. And now you may wonder, why would that be a problem? Well, it's because Japan and Korea have a geopolitical dispute in the middle of the Sea of Japan, which Korea calls the East Sea. And at the time the game was releasing, there was a heightened tension over this geopolitical dispute between the two countries. And so basically, the Korean retailers did not want to put anything on their shelf that had anything to do with Japan while this crisis was going on. And so that's why this was an issue. It had nothing to do with the game itself. It would just had to do with the box art that they chose to use. So then when the expansion pack of this game came out, you can see that most of the world saw the version in the top right with Montezuma front and center. But in Korea, we did a special version for the Korean market, which kind of was a way of making an apology for the samurai by putting a Korean general front and center. And also something like this, I've worked on a lot of games like Dance Central where, gestures and body language are very culturally specific. And so a simple gesture in one culture can mean something entirely different in another culture, or sometimes even in the same country. So like the character on the left there is doing a motion that is almost similar to what's called the bras d'honneur, which is a gesture which I think we're all familiar with, where you kind of put your one fist into the elbow pit, and it's the equivalent of the middle finger. And then the character on the right, she's doing the rock on symbol. That's what most of us would recognize. But that hand gesture has different meanings. Like in Italy, it means I'm sleeping with your wife, or it can also mean you're a cuckold. My point being is that be very, very careful about gestures. I even did a lecture at Facebook headquarters a few years back where I pointed out to them that the thumbs up symbol also means the middle finger. in some countries, but maybe that's appropriate for Facebook. I don't know. But moving on. Finally, geopolitical imagination. So this typically is where countries or governments like to reinforce what they think they own in for terms of territory. So we're talking mainly about the use of maps in games, but these can be really problematic. So if you have maps that show different depictions that a government does not agree with, you can get in trouble. Also, something like this, where this was from the Ninja Gaiden, where we had this options screen, and you can see here where it says country select, and it says, has the flag of Taiwan, and then it says ROC, which stands for Republic of China, which is the term that Taiwan uses for itself, especially for those who are pro-independence. So by using this line, country, ROC, Taiwan flag, basically you're making a very, very strong political statement that you believe that Taiwan, or the Republic of China, is a country. And so this will get you instantly banned in China for using ROC and for using the Taiwan flag. But there's a really easy way to fix this. So if you see, we basically say country/region, because then, it makes it a little more ambiguous. You don't use the flag because flags are redundant information. You don't need to include them. And then you use the term Taiwan because Taiwan is acceptable to both people in Taiwan and to mainland China. And so now you say, well, is Taiwan a country or a region? That's for the user to perceive. That's not for you as the developer to assert that. And so this makes it more palatable for you to be actually release your content by avoiding that geopolitical tension that exists between China and Taiwan. And this kind of thing happens all the time. I mean, this is some of my non-games work, but like I worked with Google to help them, do what we call domain tailoring. So when you go to different domains on the map, when you're using Google Maps, like you will see different versions of the map, because like this is the northern area of India called Kashmir. And in most of the world, you'll see this version where it's disputed on the left. But in India, you must show Kashmir as Indian territory. It's required by law. In a similar way, China has laws in the same way that you have to show Taiwan as part of China. And if you don't comply with those laws related to the maps, then your game will not sell in India or China or in other countries that have these kind of restrictions. So as I'm wrapping up here, I just want to emphasize a few things. So distribution in the content cloud today is really tricky, as we know, because when you release content, it's instantly exposed to a broad multicultural audience. So basically, there's no taking it back, as I think all of us realize. So once it's out there, and you are going to have activism from the community on all kinds of levels. So if you do something that they really love and they like it, you're going to get that huge outpouring of love through social media. But if you do something that is inaccurate or causes disruption or has some other issue, you will hear about it, as we all know, because we're all familiar with what happens on social media. Pardon me. And also that we have to be remembering that a lot of what's going on with this is that there's a battle for mind share, and games are often in the middle of that battleground. So governments and cultural institutions are fighting for who gets to control the local narrative. And so this is the reason why the Great Firewall of China exists, and why Russia has their own sovereign internet, and all these other countries are kind of moving towards this kind of, it's not a good trend, where basically they're trying to restrict the kinds of content that their people can see, because they're trying to basically control mind share over perception. And so games are in the middle of that battleground. And so oftentimes when these issues comes up, it may not be directly because of your game. It's just that your game is caught in the crosshairs of that dynamic in a specific region or a specific market. And lastly, I really want to emphasize the freedom of creativity, because I believe it's really important that you exercise your creative vision, but you just have to remember that your vision is not going to align with the expectation of other cultures. And so that's where culturalization comes in, because you have to make decisions about what you want to change or not change, depending on your goals as a creator. And so you have to be conscious of those decisions you're making during the world building process. And oftentimes it's kind of this decision, which I can call it the fulcrum of compromise, where we want to have artistic freedom and do anything we want to do. And in most places in the world, and a lot of places in the world, we do have that artistic freedom. But then if you want to maximize your revenue, you have to make choices and make changes that are going to basically make your content more compatible with different markets around the world. And this is a constant struggle. Am I a complete total artist creating anything I want to make and staying true to my creative vision? Or am I going to have a creative vision that I then change and modify in order to make sure my game can be compatible in as many places around the world? There's no right answer to this. These are two different sides to a goal, which is creating great games. And some people lean towards one angle and others lean towards another. And I'm not putting any value judgment on this. It just happens to be the way it is. But you as a game creator need to kind of think for yourselves where you fall on that spectrum when you're creating your world, because that will help guide you as well. So there you go. That is my talk. So I hope this has been useful, and I'm not sure if we're doing questions or not, but if we are, I'm willing to do so.